Okay, I've just listened to James Lindsay's The Problems with Classical Liberalism, and I would like to add to his list. Um, yeah, I would recommend that you actually listen to it. He's not he's just he should have called this podcast "The Challenges to Classical Liberalism in Our Current Historical Context" or something like that, because he doesn't see fatal problems. He just sees issues that have not been honestly politically digested in the modern era. So, places where the judiciary or the government essentially has remained unevolved. You know, one of the problems that he goes on about quite a bit is privacy and the distinction between private and public, and how we've lost that distinction, and that sort of robs us of our classically liberal humanity to some extent. I think that there are more problems that are actually more fatal, because I can see the kinds of problems that James Lindsay picks out are ones that are perfectly still situated within the American mechanical process, democratic process. And Americans really do have a lot of arrogance and haughtiness about their ongoing democracy experiment. So much so that they can't understand critiques of their system, they can't understand framework altering alternatives. Um, Let me cut to the chase and talk about what the defect with the American so-called republic is that it's not a proper republic because it doesn't have the rule of law. Law doesn't stand on its own as a pillar. Essentially, a judge is just worried about the consistency of the legislative intent in the American system. The judge is happy so long as essentially the legislature doesn't contradict itself within the overarching rules of the Constitution as well, I would say as well. But this is a kind of TI test. You know, this is why Americans conflate the rule of law, which they don't properly understand because they don't have it as a society. They conflate it with due process. America has a due process system, which again, you can see how this relates to my description of it as TI, introverted thinking. That it's just worried about self-consistency. So the voice of the democracy that is captured in the process of the legislature, that is governing society. So it is government by and for the people. Well, it's certainly by the people. I happen to think that you can make a system that's more greatly for the people if you actually entrust judges with a substantive role, and not just a lapdog role to the democracy. So that there are legal theories that are complete and independent of politics. Now, America doesn't have such a legal philosophy. The law stands as an unfinished work by the democracy, and the American citizen is sort of trapped as a lab rat in this experiment, and if it gets it wrong, then it can vote again and get it right later on. But there's so much power concentrated in the democracy to promulgate the law, to choose the law. And so there's this kind of democratic common sense which holds against the floodgate of unbridling the law. The law doesn't have its own independent tradition that is complete in a legal system. Now, there are some small fringe exceptions in the American context, but they don't operate this way on the federal level. So I think that diminishes the point. But, there are Commonwealth, or is it the Commonwealth of Philadelphia? I probably sound ignorant. I'm getting the geography mixed up. But the Commonwealth states, inherit the common law, but even the common law, can obviously be developed by a judge. It's completely subservient to the legislative promulgation. What do they even call it? There's a special title for it. Something like prerogative of the legislature. There's something that describes the plenary power of the legislature. The all-encompassing power. The far-reaching power. I think some of this plenary power must and should be held by judges in a system that is grounded in fundamental values and legal tests that together create an arsenal against the democratic will that make sure that the system stays an open liberal system. Because if the judges aren't the ones guaranteeing the open liberal system, it's interesting because there's a pseudo example. There's an example that's close to this that's kind of happening now. Just it's a controversy that the Supreme Court certainly has the capacity to resolve. So it doesn't actually fall into what the framework of what I'm talking about. Specifically, I'm talking about the fact that some states, or at least one state, has taken Donald Trump off the ballot. And the Supreme Court can essentially complain that there's a kind of procedural irregularity because it hasn't gone through a court case to ascertain questions of fact about the points in issue. That make it supposedly legally permissible to remove Donald Trump from the ballot. Anyway. The point is, that's a kind of it's a kind of black and white sort of problem. There's very little grey area here. When there's actually a contravention, which, for example, I would say, identity politics and diversity, equity, and inclusion and all these sorts of measures, even they run against the law. They run against the grain of the Constitution and they run against the law, and they get away with it. Simply because of how they have camouflaged themselves in a kind of doublespeak language. And they've redefined words. So they've protected themselves with a kind of definitional intrigue that helps them seduce the judge into giving a kind of cultural libertarian space for these people to essentially do all these things like discriminate based on race under the title anti-racism is the kind of that's the kind of galvanized point that I'm pointing it to. Anyway, let me go on to talk about what I think the problems of classical liberalism is in the American context, is that without the rule of law, you end up, or at least in the American situation, you have ended up displacing the rule of law with a kind of low-grade mysticism. Yeah, let me use as much of James Lindsay's language as I possibly can. And that mysticism and occultism has come around the being part of the process of the American democracy, that at least collectively you are this great Leviathan doing world history and being part of a lineage of a kind of kingship of a democracy, being part of this world prestige power. And having this vital agency in historical geopolitical, there's a kind of huge amount of aggrandizement, self-aggrandizement, and sort of self-elevation in a kind of spiritual project. It's a cult. To be an American is to sort of belong to this cult. Because the will of the people in America collectively get to make their mark on world history. And they can do so without having to be locked into a kind of mechanism that even protects them from breeding out their own liberalism. I.e., collectively they are a god, essentially. Collectively they are a worldly god. They really are the Leviathan. Muslims call them the Great Satan. Yeah, I mean, I don't like to agree with people that kill civilians, but I see something to that. Now, there is something, that, well, America should be judged by their actions. I don't know how to put this. It's like there is a kind of collective responsibility because of the democratic credentials of America and because of how the American state is formulated. For example, you can't go to court in America against the American state. You can't take the American state to court as a foreigner. And take its executive to task. except for probably something like procedural irregularity. So you see, that's the only measure of accountability that exists within the American system. So that as long it's a powerful machine that exerts a tremendous and lends itself a tremendous power without a certain check against democracy. And that sounds very empowering because your democracy doesn't get checked. That means collectively you can just act in the interests of pure power, which America does. That's what the American nation does. And it is not bridled by any form or system of accountability, even internally to itself. Except supposedly by the ballot box and its democracy. So its democracy collectively takes responsibility for everything. And so when people are engaged in the ritual of the American voting system, they are part of the pseudo-collective church. I haven't really roped in the religious aspect of it properly. Well, you can see how it breaks James Lindsay's definition of liberalism, because collectively they are giving themselves, they're the only ones who are conscious to what the democracy affects. So you have to appeal to the conscience of the American citizen, the American voting citizen at least. You have to appeal to the conscience of the American voting citizen. It elevates them in a way because their democracy is so potent like this, to be unaccountable only to the people of America. So much so that and they only rule themselves with this same power. So they do not have the rule of law, they have the rule of man. It's man governing man. The state is never entrenched. Against the people, or at least the collective will of the people. And I really am skirting the issue here. This is annoying me greatly. I'm not articulating this point properly. I'm just trying to think how to get to it from this point. I mean, it creates a definitional problem within the American psyche. I can say that for sure. Because when you don't have the rule of law, you can't have a conception of justice. Justice is the fiat of the collective will of the American people. Decides it to be. And then you have some people who say things like, why not legislate morality? Which both some conservatives want to do and some woke people want to do. You wouldn't have a problem with people wanting to legislate morality if the law itself was robust enough and values-laden enough and had enough rights in a Bill of Rights to fend off and to ascertain what morality should be extended into the law, or what morality the law might contain. Carving out, firstly, robust space for things like the right to privacy, etc., etc., etc. So you see how my formulation of needing the rule of law solves some of James Lindsay's problems that he goes into. Because he goes into the problem of intellectual property and privacy and ownership. Sorry, the intellectual property thing is more connected only to the issue of ownership. That when you don't have secure property that is actually owned by you in its full sense, because if you don't have the right to repair it, or you don't have the right to own the intellectual property that digitally makes it function. Anyway, I don't want to re-articulate James Lindsay's problems. But I'm just showing that these problems are downstream of the fact that America doesn't have the rule of law. Because if America had the rule of law, you could actually go to court and essentially get the court to legislate or to order legislation that covers certain purports, that fulfills a certain function, and the court can provide intermediary relief until the legislature makes such legislation. So it gives the legislature time to calculate maybe how it wants to do it in a democratic, or according to its democratic credentials. So here you can have a certain harmony where the judge is handing over to the state to democratically do something if it so wills, and then it can order that if the legislation is not made, then something that is rationally good enough is put into the law. So you have judges writing legislation, at least default legislation. Judges should be able to write default legislation in defense of constitutional rights. That's how strong a constitution you need to have, so that you don't have to worry about a constitution being taken over by the left or the right, or by the radicals of one or the radicals of another, or by, so that you have an open liberal scaffolding that sustains an open liberal system and doesn't allow for paradoxes, like, for example, the intolerance paradox. And so it will be able to spit out the woke stuff. It will be able to identify it as essentially fascist and fundamentally illiberal and therefore inconsistent with the Constitution. And so, its principles will not be allowed in things like policy, public policy of state institutions, like, for example, universities. Anyway. So, America needs an independent legal theory. It needs a substantive legal leap forward so that it can actually have a proper judiciary, and then it can actually have the rule of law. Something that is consistent but more robust than the current American constitutional rights. And America can certainly keep the Second Amendment and the First Amendment. Sorry, which one is it? That is the guns. It's the Second Amendment, isn't it? They can still have that mechanism that sort of keeps the power in the whip hand of the American people, at the end of the day, because the people can be well armed and have regulated militias. So you can still have a lot of the same democratic spirit. You just have essentially, you don't have to worry about electing officials to sort problems out, individuals can also sort problems out via the courts, and not having to be sort of on the partisan side of your elected officials. Because, something that the American system doesn't really do is it doesn't really have safeguards for minorities. And I don't mean that, I'm not referring to racial minorities. I mean sort of minorities in anything. You don't get a lot of traction if you don't have actual democratic sway. And people might say, well, that's how we want to be governed. Well, I think, to generalize my point, the problem with the American system is that there's nothing really stopping the government from getting into the business of culture. And maybe government should be in the business of culture to some extent, to the reproduction of culture or the promotion of certain kinds of culture. But it needs a style guide, I would say, that is not just brought to it by democratic fiat and the will of the electorate, let's say, but that is tempered by a judiciary that actually has a kind of deep common sense and philosophy that systematizes rights and that allows them to flow also from values that are fundamental, that can be used in limitations testing when rights are being limited. Because it's much better to describe a situation where you mediate the limitation of rights, almost anticipating infringement, rather than saying that infringement must just never occur, because then you have lines in the sand that are actually drawn quite too close. It's like the freedom of speech is only guaranteed against the state. It's not guaranteed against other private individuals. If a private individual had enough money, they could essentially, using legal means, essentially make life very difficult for people that exercise their freedom of speech if they chose their targets arbitrarily. You could persecute ordinary people perhaps and just ramp up legal costs for them and make their life very inconvenient. The private power in America does not have any constraint in terms of freedom of speech. So I mean that's one such oversight. Obviously there are state laws and state constitutions that also might supplement for certain protections, that certain freedoms that are held out and held up not only against state organs but also private organs or private organizations rather. But then I wonder if states do that, if they aren't themselves in contravention of the, is it the First Amendment? Yes. I believe it's the First Amendment. I'm getting the first and second jumbled in my mind. Anyway, I hope people can see the problem that I'm hopefully elucidating. But yeah, I do think Americans are actually too drunk on their system. And I mean that, in the metaphorical sense of inebriated, that they wouldn't give up the power. They couldn't see their wings clipped, because that would remove their special spiritual status as a kind of worldly god in the collective form. I'm surprised James Lindsay, surely he must have intuited something of this at yet. Maybe he can't see it because it's the subtext to everything that he talks about in this recording of the problems with classical liberalism. I would say it's the subtext. Maybe he hasn't pondered it yet.